Fort Myers has always carried a certain promise, the postcard image of Florida's paradise brought to life. Sun-splashed canals lined with fishing boats, neighborhoods that seem to grow overnight, and retirees arriving in waves to trade snow shovels for sunshine. It wasn't just another coastal city, it became a symbol of Florida's unstoppable growth, a place where land was transformed into fortune and where buying a home felt like buying into a dream. For years, the formula never seemed to fail. Developers carved out sprawling subdivisions, investors snapped up waterfront condos, and families stretched their savings just to secure a slice of Fort Myers' promise. Every new arrival meant another sold home, another booming neighborhood, another sign that the engine of growth would never stop. Real estate wasn't just part of Fort Myers' identity, it was the lifeblood that powered jobs, businesses, and the very sense of prosperity itself. But now, that machine has stalled. Interest rates climbed, insurance premiums skyrocketed, and buyers began to hesitate. What once felt like an endless cycle of demand suddenly cracked, leaving open houses quiet and for sale signs multiplying on streets that were supposed to symbolize stability. For the first time in decades, Fort Myers' real estate market isn't surging upward, it's sinking. The shock has spread so quickly that even Florida's governor, long known for projecting calm confidence, has been forced to address it directly. His unease has become a symbol of how fragile the foundation really is. Because in Fort Myers, when the housing market stumbles, it's not just prices that fall, it's the entire illusion of paradise that begins to crumble. The rise of Fort Myers' boomtown image. To understand why the crash has rattled so many, you first have to understand what Fort Myers became over the last 2 decades. This wasn't just another Florida city with palm trees and sunshine. Fort Myers transformed into a magnet for retirees, investors, and families who saw it as the next great coastal haven. Its growth was nothing short of astonishing. Neighborhoods that were once sleepy pockets of single-story homes turned into sprawling developments seemingly overnight. The skyline sprouted cranes, while canals lined with modest fishing cottages gave way to luxury condos marketed as the last affordable waterfront in Florida. Every marketing brochure promised the same thing: a chance to live where others vacation. And for a long time, those promises delivered. Between 2010 and 2022, Fort Myers' population surged, businesses thrived, and real estate values climbed year after year. Investors from out of state treated Fort Myers like an ATM. Buy a property, wait a few months, flip it for a quick profit. Locals who once thought they'd never see their modest homes appreciate suddenly watched their property values double. For realtors, contractors, and builders, it was a golden era. Fort Myers wasn't just growing, it was exploding. The city earned a reputation as one of the hottest housing markets in the nation. Headlines called it Florida's best-kept secret, and magazines highlighted its blend of affordability and coastal beauty. To outsiders, it looked like Fort Myers had cracked the code to endless growth. To insiders, it felt like the party would never end. But beneath the champagne glow of sold homes and booming construction sites, cracks were already forming. Prices were rising far faster than wages. Insurance premiums were quietly climbing, and dependence on speculative buying made the city vulnerable. Nobody wanted to say it out loud at the time, but Fort Myers wasn't building stability, it was building a bubble. And as with every bubble in history, all it needed was the right pressure to burst. The signs of trouble nobody wanted to see. The first warnings didn't come with a bang. They came as whispers. Realtors noticed it before anyone else. The once packed open houses were quieter, the bidding wars that used to erupt in living rooms began to fade, and buyers who once rushed to make offers started hesitating. It was subtle at first, just a few deals falling through here and there. But in Fort Myers, where demand had always outpaced supply, even a pause felt unnatural. Then came the numbers. Mortgage rates that hovered near historic lows suddenly began climbing, putting pressure on buyers who were already stretching their budgets to the limit. A family that could once afford a 3-bedroom home near the river suddenly found themselves priced out. Out-of-state investors who had fueled so much of the frenzy realized their quick profit flips were no longer guaranteed wins. Slowly, but unmistakably, the tide was turning. Local homeowners began to notice another creeping threat: insurance premiums. In Fort Myers, where coastal storms and flooding risks are part of life, Insurance isn't optional, it's a lifeline. But premiums started spiking to record levels, doubling or even tripling in some cases. For many, the dream of living in paradise was being choked by bills they could no longer afford. What good is a house by the water if the insurance to protect it costs more than the mortgage? Construction, too, began to stall. Developers who once broke ground on massive projects with confidence started to hit the brakes. Unsold inventory stacked up, and contractors who had spent years juggling back-to-back jobs suddenly found themselves with empty schedules. It wasn't just a housing market cooling, it was the unraveling of the very machine that had powered Fort Myers' rise. Yet even as the warning signs became impossible to ignore, denial ran deep. Local business owners insisted it was just a temporary slowdown. Some realtors told anxious sellers to hold tight, that the market would bounce back in a few months. After all, Fort Myers had always been a boomtown. The idea that the boom could turn to bust wasn't just unthinkable, it was almost taboo. But markets don't run on denial, and as the pressure built, the cracks widened. What began as whispers was about to roar into a full-blown crisis. The crash becomes unavoidable. At first, many thought it was just a correction, a little dip before the next big rise. But in Fort Myers, the decline didn't stop. By the time the spring sales season rolled around, the cracks had widened into a chasm. Listings that once sold within days began to linger for weeks, then months. Streets that had once been dotted with celebratory sold signs were suddenly littered with price reduction banners, each slash of red ink a sign of desperation. The numbers told the story even more clearly than the streets did. Median home prices, which had skyrocketed over the last decade, started sliding. Appraisals began coming in lower than expected, derailing sales at the last minute. Buyers who had overextended themselves during the frenzy started backing out, sometimes forfeiting deposits rather than getting locked into deals they knew would sink them financially. For many families, it wasn't just about losing equity, it was about survival. A homeowner who had purchased a modest house at the peak suddenly owed more than the property was worth. Others who had planned to retire on their home's rising value found themselves trapped, unable to sell without taking massive losses. Even longtime locals who had owned their homes for years felt the shock. Property values were falling, but insurance and taxes weren't. It was a squeeze that cut across every neighborhood, from quiet inland subdivisions to the priciest waterfront estates. And then came the wave of foreclosures. Families who had once dreamed of paradise were now facing bank notices pinned to their doors. Investors who had scooped up multiple properties during the boom years began dumping them at fire sale prices, flooding the market and dragging values down even further. It was the kind of spiral that feeds on itself. Falling prices created panic, and panic created more falling prices. For the businesses that relied on Fort Myers' housing engine, construction crews, landscapers, contractors, realtors, even small shops near new developments, the slowdown was devastating. Entire projects stalled halfway through, leaving skeletons of half-built homes baking in the Florida sun. What once symbolized opportunity now stood as monuments to overreach. By now, the crash wasn't just a possibility, it was a reality. And the people of Fort Myers could no longer deny it. The market that had once seemed indestructible had not just cooled, it had collapsed. The shockwaves through the community. When a real estate market crashes, it's not just numbers on a chart, it's people's lives unraveling in real time. In Fort Myers, the shockwaves spread far beyond the families forced to sell their homes at a loss or walk away altogether. Entire neighborhoods began to change almost overnight. In subdivisions that had once buzzed with kids riding bikes and families barbecuing in driveways, for sale signs popped up like weeds. Streets that felt alive now carried a quieter, uneasy energy, as if everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Some homeowners who had stretched every dollar to buy at the peak started cutting back on everything else just to keep up with rising costs, skipping vacations, delaying medical care, and working extra shifts. The dream of living in Florida's paradise was now a daily financial grind. Retirees, too, were hit especially hard. Many had poured their savings into Fort Myers real estate as a final investment, expecting steady appreciation to fund their golden years. Instead, they watched their nest eggs shrink as values tumbled. For some, downsizing wasn't even an option. The equity they thought they had built was gone. In retirement communities across Fort Myers, conversations that once centered on golf and grandkids turned instead to worries about bills and dwindling options. Small businesses felt the pinch just as severely. The housing boom had fueled nearly every corner of the local economy. Restaurants thrived on new residents. Landscapers stayed booked year-round. Furniture stores sold out as homes filled up. But with fewer closings and more financial strain, spending slowed dramatically. A contractor who once had months of work lined up suddenly found himself staring at an empty calendar. A local cafe owner watched foot traffic shrink as her regulars tightened their budgets. The ripple effect was unavoidable. When the housing market stumbled, Fort Myers' economic heartbeat weakened. And then there was the emotional toll. Home ownership in Fort Myers wasn't just about shelter, it was tied to identity, pride, and the sense of having made it in paradise. To lose that stability was more than a financial setback. It was a psychological blow. Families who had once felt secure now questioned their future in the very city they had chosen to call home. The crash wasn't just a statistic. It was a collective reckoning, reshaping the lives of thousands of ordinary people in ways that charts and graphs could never fully capture. The governor's uneasy response. For weeks, officials tried to downplay the unraveling in Fort Myers. Local leaders repeated familiar talking points about market cycles and temporary adjustments. But as the for sale signs multiplied and foreclosure notices spread, the silence from the state's top office grew harder to ignore. Eventually, the governor was forced to address what everyone already knew. The Fort Myers real estate market was in freefall. It happened during a routine press conference, the kind usually reserved for safe talking points about Florida's growth and resilience. But this time, the questions from reporters cut sharper. They wanted answers about collapsing property values, retirees watching their savings vanish, and construction sites left abandoned in the middle of neighborhoods. The governor, usually calm and collected, showed cracks in his composure. His voice faltered, his tone sharpened, and his attempts at reassurance carried more nerves than confidence. For many watching, that moment became symbolic. If even the governor, the figurehead of Florida's steady growth narrative, seemed rattled, then the situation was far more serious than officials wanted to admit. His unease echoed the feelings of thousands across Fort Myers: uncertainty, fear, and the sinking realization that the city's foundation wasn't as solid as everyone believed. The governor's words didn't calm the panic. If anything, they fueled it. Local headlines captured the tension, noting how rare it was to see such visible anxiety from a state leader. Residents shared clips online dissecting his every phrase, pointing out how his tone seemed to betray the very confidence he was trying to project. Instead of reassurance, the moment became confirmation. The market's collapse wasn't just real, it was now undeniable at every level. For Fort Myers, that public slip wasn't just political theater. It was a mirror reflecting the fear gripping homeowners, investors, and businesses alike. If the state's highest office couldn't hide its panic, how could ordinary families? The collapse of investor confidence. If the governor's uneasy words marked the public acknowledgement of the crisis, the flight of investors marked its acceleration. Fort Myers had long thrived on outside money. Buyers from the Midwest, the Northeast, even overseas investors who saw the Gulf Coast as a gold mine. They weren't just purchasing homes, they were buying entire neighborhoods, betting big that Florida's population growth would guarantee endless returns. But investors are quick to move when the tide turns. As property values slipped, their confidence eroded almost overnight. Flippers who had once fought to outbid each other began rushing to unload their holdings before prices fell further. Condos that had been bought in bulk sat unsold, their glossy brochures now relics of a market that no longer existed. For every investor pulling out, the pressure on Fort Myers' housing stock grew heavier. Developers, too, began retreating. Large projects that had been announced with fanfare, sprawling subdivisions, waterfront towers, retirement complexes, suddenly went dark. Sales offices that once bustled with eager buyers turned into empty showrooms, their lights dimmed, their staff reduced. Financing dried up as lenders grew cautious, unwilling to back ventures in a market that no longer looked like a safe bet. The collapse of investor confidence created a domino effect. With fewer buyers, inventory piled higher. With more inventory, prices sank faster. Each desperate listing sent ripples through the market, dragging down appraisals, fueling more panic, and scaring off the few buyers still considering a move. For ordinary homeowners, the presence of investors had once been a blessing. Their purchases kept prices soaring and demand hot. Now, their exodus was a curse. Families who had counted on rising values to refinance, sell, or retire suddenly found themselves competing against investor-owned fire sales. Even well-kept homes in desirable areas couldn't escape the drag of plummeting comps from desperate sellers. By the end of the summer, the shift was unmistakable. The same outsiders who had helped build Fort Myers' reputation as one of the nation's hottest housing markets were now abandoning it, leaving locals to deal with the wreckage. What had once felt like easy money had turned into quicksand, swallowing fortunes and dreams alike. The domino effect on local businesses. Real estate wasn't just a market in Fort Myers. It was the engine that powered almost every part of the local economy. When that engine sputtered, the effects rippled outward, touching businesses that at first seemed far removed from home sales. The collapse wasn't confined to the housing charts. It was felt on every street corner, in every shop, in every restaurant that had once thrived on the promise of constant growth. Contractors and construction crews were among the first to feel the blow. For years, their calendars had been packed, with jobs lined up months in advance. But as projects stalled and developers backed out, those schedules emptied. Equipment sat idle, and crews that once worked overtime now scrambled to find any kind of work. Subcontractors, roofers, electricians, plumbers, who had depended on steady demand found themselves competing for fewer and fewer gigs, often undercutting each other just to stay afloat. Local shops and restaurants soon felt the slowdown as well. New residents who once filled furniture stores, appliance showrooms, and home decor boutiques stopped spending. The steady flow of customers that had come from freshly moved-in families vanished. Restaurants near new subdivisions watched their tables sit empty on weekends, their staff cutting hours or leaving altogether. The ripple effect was brutal. When fewer homes sold, fewer people celebrated with dinners out. Fewer bought paint and patio furniture, and fewer signed up for gym memberships or yoga classes. Even small service businesses tied to the housing boom, landscapers, pool cleaners, home inspectors, felt the pinch. Where once every new arrival meant a new client, now cancellations piled up. Families cutting costs decided to mow their own lawns or clean their own pools, stripping away what had once been reliable income for local workers. The crash even seeped into tourism, another lifeline of Fort Myers. Vacationers who once toyed with the idea of buying a second home pulled back, choosing instead to rent for a week rather than invest long-term. Real estate had been a powerful magnet, drawing outsiders who often doubled as tourists and investors. Without that dual pull, hotel bookings and seasonal rentals took a hit too. The dominoes kept falling. A market once built on perpetual motion had ground to a halt, and with it, the businesses that had counted on that motion found themselves struggling to survive. For many in Fort Myers, it wasn't just the housing dream collapsing, it was the entire economic ecosystem that had grown up around it. The human cost, families caught in the crossfire. Numbers can tell part of the story. The falling prices, the spike in foreclosures, the shrinking sales. But behind every statistic in Fort Myers was a family forced into impossible choices. The real estate crash didn't just erase wealth on paper, it tore into daily life. For some, the reality arrived in the form of a foreclosure notice taped to the front door. Families who had once celebrated closing day with balloons and champagne now faced the humiliation of packing boxes, knowing their home would be auctioned to strangers. Children asked why they had to leave their bedrooms, why their toys couldn't come with them, and parents had no easy answers. For many, moving out meant not just losing a house, it meant losing a neighborhood, a school, and a sense of stability that might never return. Others found themselves trapped, clinging to homes they could barely afford. Couples who had planned to sell and relocate closer to family discovered they couldn't. Their home was worth less than their mortgage. Retirees who had dreamed of enjoying the Florida sun in peace found themselves dipping into savings just to cover rising insurance and tax bills. Some quietly returned to work, taking part-time jobs not out of choice, but out of necessity. The emotional weight was heavy. Neighbors who had once waved over fences now spoke in hushed tones about how much they'd lost, or what they'd do if the bills didn't ease. Communities that had thrived on optimism began to feel like places of quiet resignation. The sense of Fort Myers as a paradise had been replaced by the feeling of being caught in a storm with no clear end in sight. At its heart, the crash wasn't about markets or numbers. It was about people watching their version of the American dream collapse in slow motion. For Fort Myers, that was the harshest cost of all: the crumbling illusion of paradise. The collapse of Fort Myers' real estate market didn't just expose financial vulnerabilities, it shattered a myth. For decades, the city had been sold as a foolproof paradise, a place where sunshine guaranteed prosperity and home values could only move in one direction: up. That illusion fueled waves of investment, migration, and growth. But when the foundation cracked, the dream came crashing down with it. The governor's moment of panic, caught on camera, will likely be remembered not as a political misstep, but as a symbol of truth. That even those in power could no longer hide the fear gripping the community. Fort Myers, once the poster child of Florida's boom, had become its cautionary tale. The story isn't just about houses. It's about fragility. It's about how quickly confidence can evaporate, how fast fortunes can be reversed, and how deeply the ripple effects of a single market can reshape an entire city. Fort Myers will rebuild, as cities always do, but the scars of this crash will linger. For those who lost homes, savings, and stability, the memory won't fade with the next economic upswing. Paradise had always been marketed as permanent. The crash proved it was only ever temporary.